our Surfacing Creative Leadership conversation on the critical reactive tendency of the LCP. As you get settled and as we give everyone an opportunity to join the call and maybe give a minute or two to folks who are joining a little bit late, head over to the chat. Let us know where you're joining us from today and maybe what you're hoping to gain out of this conversation or what you're hoping to learn about the critical dimension. One note about the chat. During the webinar today, you might notice Corey. Corey, I don't know if you want to wave real fast, but you might notice Corey drop a comment or a question into the chat. And really, we just invite you to reflect, to respond. Those prompts are meant to kind of get you thinking about the topic at hand and make this really an even richer conversation for everyone. So with that, I'll introduce myself. My name is Sarah. I'm Senior Content Editor for Leadership Circle, and I'll be your host today. I'm located in Tacoma, Washington, which is in the upper left corner of the continental United States, where it's actually turning out to be a beautiful fall day for me here. And I know it's not fall for everyone joining us, but for me it is. Today's webinar marks the sixth Surfacing Creative Leadership conversation that we've had unpacking the dimensions of the LCP. So far, we've explored purposeful and visionary, conservative, personal learner, fosters team play. Last month was perfect. And then in a few minutes, we'll dive into critical. If you have missed any of these webinars or any of our content about surfacing creative leadership over the last 5 or 6 months, head over to the Leadership Circle YouTube channel and definitely check out the Surfacing Creative Leadership playlist. There you'll find not just recordings of webinars like this one, but also recorded conversations with Bill and Bob, who are talking about each dimension. And listen, those are worth the price of admission, honestly, because we all know that the two of them can weave a great story. And when they start talking about the dimensions, it's a really rich conversation. So highly recommend. But those, not even just those are there too. We also have our data wizardry videos. We've been working with Leadership Circle psychometrician Joseph Lehman, who will take us into a deep dive into key data points for each of the dimensions that we're exploring. So there's some really good stuff there on YouTube. Highly suggest that you recommend. You can bookmark that playlist and then visit often for new videos. So let's see where folks are from, what everyone is hoping to get out of today's conversation. Looks like we've got people coming from all over the place. Adelaide, South Australia. We've got folks from the US, California, Sydney, Virginia. This is excellent. We're hoping to see everyone or see people come from all over the place. And it's always good to welcome you in from all sorts of places. So thanks for coming and for joining us. Finally, before we get started, I do just want to go through a couple of housekeeping items. First, please keep yourself on mute. We've all been on conversations. It's sometimes so hard to remember or, so easy to forget that you might not be on mute. In fact, I was just on a call the other night and my phone rang and my doorbell rang and I was highly embarrassed. So we just ask that you double check and make sure that you're on mute for the call. Second, if you feel comfortable doing so, turn your camera on. It's always a pleasure for us to look into a sea of faces instead of blank screens. Although that said, we also know that we're reaching people in all different time zones today. So if you are making breakfast or running a child to cello lessons or doing something else and you don't really want to be on camera, that is understandable and just fine. And then finally, I just want to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and we'll be sending out a link so that you can watch it within about a week or so. That'll also include a summary of the conversation. So if you do have to hop off early or you're not able to tune in for the whole conversation, you won't miss anything. And with that, I think I'll just look around, make sure that we've got everything covered and we're ready to begin. I think so. All right, so let us officially kick off. Welcome again to our Surfacing Creative Leadership conversation on the critical dimension of the Leadership Circle profile. Look, I've said it before, and I will say it again. Our world needs creative leadership. And we at Leadership Circle know that coaches and leaders like you are in the best position possible to provide that, whether that's through your own leadership or through the way that you guide others to grow into theirs. With our Surfacing Creative Leadership series, we're beginning an ongoing conversation to unpack, demystify, and surface insights within the dimensions of the LCP, one dimension at a time. Today, we're exploring critical, the reactive tendency that reflects a leader's tendency to question, to critique, and to challenge, and how that tendency can erode trust and morale when it slips into fault finding or criticism. To get us started, consider how critical might show up in your own life and in you. Put your answers in the chat. We'd love to hear about that. And while you're doing that, it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our guests today, Brett Wood and Peter Shields. First up, we're joined by Brett Wood, seasoned coach and facilitator who helps leaders build the practices of turning insight into action and vision into reality. Whether he's working one-on-one with execs or guiding large-scale group dialogue, Brett brings a rare blend of clarity, wholeheartedness, and practicality to the work of leadership. His clients describe him as incisive, yet deeply empathetic, someone who creates the kind of space where real growth and transformation can happen. And when he's not immersed in helping teams discover what's possible, Brett can often be found indulging his love of sci-fi or chasing winter's best skiing days. And I just heard him mention before we started this call that he saw dolphins yesterday at the beach. So clearly he's a beachgoer too. And then also with us today is Peter Shields, executive coach and transformational consultant who's been helping leaders and teams expand their capacity for more than 2 decades. With a background spanning business leadership, psychotherapy, and coaching, Peter brings both psychological depth and business acumen to all of his work. He's known for helping leaders access their collective intelligence, navigate change with purpose, and bring out the very best in themselves and in each other. Peter's approach balances empathy and challenge in equal measure, something particularly relevant to critical. And it's always in the service of meaningful results. Outside of work, he brings the same curiosity and care to life that he brings to coaching. So, Brett, Peter, welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to get started in this conversation.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you, Sarah.
absolutely. So let's get started with with the basics. Let's just dig in at a real level, set level. In your work, debriefing and coaching and working with leaders, how do you introduce the critical reactive tendency? What do we mean when we talk about critical?
I'm smiling because I'm just reading in the chat box a wonderful post from Chris. When I'm feeling the critical thinking, I lean way hard into expert explainer. Sigh. Thanks, Chris. And thank you all for those comments just pouring in. We love the interactive quality here. Yeah, how do I explain critical? Well, it's the mind, right? So let's start at the foundational level, the rational mind. It's a strength like all the reactive. So let's sit with that. It's great strength of the mind to stand back, to look, to pull things apart, the sharpness of it. And because it's reactive, it's driven by fear. So when that sharp mind boots up on fear and stress, it's, it lands as rigid and negative. Great for focusing on what's wrong, but not so great for exploring what's possible. So can be a real roadblock to the creative mind, which of course is very focused on what's possible here for an organization, a customer, a stakeholder group, whatever. Hard to explore what's possible when the critical mind is putting every idea through a rigid, rigorous, filter of what's wrong with this idea. Pete, what's going through your mind?
Yeah, thank you, Brett. I'm remembering the debrief process and the use of the brochure, and always I use the turnaround guy from from the main brochure that we always use. And Sarah, I invite people to look around the circle to understand the inner circle and the outer circle, and then just invite them to read through the outer dimensions and check in for each one to see if they're having questions about the reactive dimensions and the creative. And I notice I'm watching out for how they receive the words critical and arrogant, for example. Often there's curiosity about distant. So when I notice how they, talk about that or how they infer what the meaning there is, sometimes the opportunity pops up to ask a question.
I love that you're already talking about something that I mean I'm hoping to get to later, but maybe it's important to bring up now is that spark of curiosity of being interested in what this might means instead of being prescriptive about what one of these dimensions mean.
Mm.
So at the risk of contradicting what I literally just said, and you touched on this a little bit already, Brett, but and I see several comments that touch on this. How might critical show up for a leader, or even when they're responding to the outer dimensions, and you're starting to just see how a leader reacts in the debrief process. How might critical surface in an interaction in a coaching session?
Wow, that's a great question. We've all seen or heard Bob say, it's the profile is a representation of the person. So as professional coach, we're always aware of what the interaction is like in the coaching conversation or in the debrief conversation. How critical shows up is, pretty depending on how strong it is, of course. But boy, I've seen a range of that from just criticizing the room that we're sitting in or criticizing the process getting onto Zoom. Well, we're running one certification and a participant showed up into the certification who was critical of the temperature of the room and the kettle didn't boil the water fast enough and the music that I was playing in the room wasn't working. So, Sarah, I was very alive upon seeing that, thinking, wow, we're in a workshop for 3 days.
Yikes.
What about for you, Brett? What have you seen?
I remember a client reading through the comments, and there was a lot of challenging things said in the comments about her high critical. She said, "Well, you know what, Brett? I don't suffer fools."
Mm.
And I've heard variations on that quite a bit. So
Right.
there's
Yeah.
something there isn't there. I'm guarding myself against all the foolishness of the world, which I can see. And again, I always want to reiterate it is a strength. There is a lot of foolishness in the world, and God love us all who can be skeptical about it and criticize it. But yeah, what I was curious about was that was the go-to. The first response wasn't, "Oh, look at these wonderful, thoughtful comments that people have taken the time to give me as the gift of feedback." It was basically, they're a bunch of fools. And if only they could see it, the world would be better.
Yeah. You're reminding me, Brett, I had one leader say, these idiots don't know me
Well,
when they was reading their written comments and seeing the critical score. Yeah.
so how do you get past that? Because that's a pretty strong wall that someone puts up right away. In what is meant to be a conversation where you're gonna have to kind of pry them open a little bit. As a coach, how do you address that?
Yeah. Are you okay, Brett, if I jump on that one? What what I've learned across many debriefs is I've established the process, then I follow the process. So when a comment like that, these idiots don't know me, I tend to let it be as it is, Sarah, and allow the conversation to continue. Should it show up as a pattern, which is three or more occasions, um, and of course we're reading the interaction with the person, we're there as the guide to support them to know themselves better. So of course in a debrief, the timing is important to keep going. And it's a hold a belief that as a person speaks out aloud, they hear themselves too, especially a person who's high on critical. So I tend to let it go and I remember it. And if the pattern shows up, and depending if it's debrief A or debrief B or a coaching conversation, it brings a different context to how I might respond to it.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm the same. I play a long game. So the first response is, if I'm critical, it's in my conditioning to guard myself. So I want to appreciate that and respect that, and let there be a bit of space for defensiveness. I learned in my early mistakes, my early days, trying to fix or change, or the idea of getting someone beyond their critical so that we can do the work is a real error of thinking on my part. The work starts with them being able to voice their response. Often they come around themselves. I find this more often than not. I had someone the other day who, again, in the comment section, defended themselves against a comment that said they found that they were too critical. And they defended themselves against it immediately. I know who that is. I know who said that. But about 10 minutes later, when we were into the circle graph, and they're looking at critical, they brought it up again. And that often happens. And so then we're in a very powerful position to start exploring. If they don't bring it up, same as Pete, I'm noticing a pattern, and there will come a point where I'll say, hey, I'm noticing that the way you tend to explain the world around you is through what's wrong with other people. That's happened several times. Are there any other explanations for what's going on here that might implicate you? So I'm quite happy to challenge, but I want to make sure I've got a good rapport and trust with the person. I've got to sort of earn that right, I think.
And once Brett, I don't know if you agree with this, once you have that right and people relax into the process and they're there to receive their debrief, at the right time, Sarah, I like to, again, if I hear it again, I say, oh, what do you mean?
Mm.
And they say, well, sometimes I say, what? So, well, I just heard you say, it's probably the third or fourth time in this last 90 minutes, just heard you say that these people don't know you and they're idiots anyway. What do you mean by that? And in that exploration, the truth that's available to them at that moment can be revealed by their own words. That's how I challenge if the pattern shows up again.
I think there's also an avenue of inquiry, and this is something I really learned from you, Pete, that just the value of, at the right time, inviting them to shift from talking about it to actually recalling an event or a situation. Such a powerful way of exploring, because then you're sort of getting beyond, like, is this true? Is it not true? Is it just a perception? What do they know? Agree, disagree. You're in a whole different space when you say, can you think of an example? So jumping back to my client who said, I don't suffer fools. So there's an opportunity to go, so can you give me an example of the foolishness that you don't want to suffer?
Right. Yeah.
And she did. And then we're in a whole different place here, because we're entering into her world with respect and regard, because I don't know her world, right? But giving her a chance to unpack it. And that can include what's happening out in the world around her and the context she's dealing with, the very real challenges and foolishness. And then there comes a point in that, quite naturally, where we say, and how do you show up in the face of that? Like, what have you noticed? What's the felt sense in your body? What are the indicators in your body? That foolishness is all around you and you're suffering it. And where does your mind go? And then what do you notice about your behavior? So that's a sort of invitation for them to start things that they might be doing habitually and unconsciously. They can now take perspective on. It's that subject-object shift.
I love that. And you're moving right into kind of the perfect next point that I'm hoping to cover, which is really using critical using this dimension as an entry point for exploration during a debrief or a coaching conversation. So, that's come up a couple times in our surfacing creative leadership conversations, this somatic tie. How does it feel in your body? And this kind of concrete to being present in the moment and a physical experience. Uh, Maybe can you say a little bit more about that? I mean, Brett, you just gave a great description of a couple of questions you can ask to get somebody to be thinking about those things, but how else can you kind of use critical as this entry point?
There's the questions related to the dimensions are a great way in for any dimension, not just critical, but let's just remember the power of it at some point saying, hey, well, what do we mean by critical? As in what's been assessed, what's actually been assessed. So another tip I modeled from Pete is, Pete, you invite people to read the descriptions out loud. I do that all the time now. It's so powerful. So we go to the point in the report where there are the questions related to each dimension, which are also descriptions. And say, would you mind reading them out loud? It's just good to give them a voice. Now that's somatic work, by the way, and it's quite gentle somatic work. It's not asking someone to do something they might be very unfamiliar with and might appear just right outside their comfort zone. But it is somatic because they're engaging their breath and their vocal cords. And when someone says out loud, I hurt people's feelings, I'm sarcastic and cynical. It's very different from just reading it. Pete, I'll bounce to you. Where are you at with this entry points?
Yeah, again, the inflections, the little gestures, the body shifts all provide insight, Sarah, as to how the person's responding. And again, depending on the trust level, depending on the quality of the relationship, there's much we can do. Clearly, asking the questions about, well, as you say that out aloud, what are you noticing? That's how I start with someone who may be scoring high in critical, and that's especially if it's by self-score and by other, because we sort of run some reliability around the parity in how they've scored themselves. I'll start with, what are you noticing? So they might be comfortable to enter into that and go, oh, noticing, do I notice? And they might enter from a thinking perspective and then toggle accordingly to how they go and how they respond.
You just touched on something I think is really interesting, and maybe it's interesting because of my own LCP and it says more about me than anything else. But it can become clear looking at a report that how we see ourselves and how others see us can vary wildly. So, can you talk a little bit about that when you see maybe large gaps in someone's self-score and the way that their evaluators are scoring them, or when it is really very close? Like what can that what insight can that give you about maybe how the leader operates, or can it give you any insight into this coaching conversation and what the leader's doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And especially in how they interpret it. So my go-to is always to check in with, what are they seeing and what are they interpreting? And assuming that dries up and there is, space for contribution, I personally see the debrief process as the opportunity for that leader to get to know herself better because of the process and because of the 360. Not just what's on the 360. So as Brett's pointed out, the comments added a lot of wealth and insight. Usually the origin story of the patterns and habits of thinking bring a lot of insight as well. So as you're aware, Sarah, it all rolls and builds into awareness. And my interest is that it's ascending to objectivity. And therefore, I personally weight the self-score as more valid I'm not sure if that statistically is accurate or valuable or not, but given its opinion, how did I score? I had this leader score themselves, and how did others in that context of that organization at that time, those evaluators interpret this person's leadership actions and behaviors? I always weight the self-score as more valid. And my wisdom in that is when I've triggered the person's identity and the ego defense structures of their identity, the awareness descends about knowing themselves better.
Yeah, can I jump in on that one? It's, you know, when there's let's say the gap between self and evaluators is a self score that's low and a evaluator score that's high. Again, I'll start with what not to do. Like, you know, don't try to change their mind. Just like explore the gap. And as I always say, you know, I don't want to debate someone who needs to be the smartest person in the room because I'm going to lose. I'm just going to lose. Or because, to be honest, I've got a bit of protecting in myself. My protecting is going to kick in, and then we're engaged in a kind of subtle or not so subtle battle for who's right. So again, if we connect it to life on the ground, then it doesn't matter like who's got the truth. What we know is that, okay, you know, all evaluators, you're rated the 80th percentile critical. So it's factual to say that when compared to a norm group, you know, you're amongst the most critical people. Now, if they say, well, in my mind, I'm not being critical, I'm just saying what needs to be said. Cool, it doesn't matter. Because what I can say is, well, can you think of a situation where you're just saying what needs to be said and other people are experiencing that as being put down? So I'm not, doesn't matter which one, like, but can you think of a situation where these perceptions are in play? And then we're in the same territory again, aren't we? Well, what's it like to be you in those situations? How does it feel? Where does your head space go? What do you feel? And that state you're in, what behavior does that propel you into? Okay, well, what's now here we're into another beautiful realm which we emphasize in certifications, which is gifts and costs. It's such a beautiful line of inquiry. We're getting out of the binary of, you know, right or wrong or good or bad, and we're just saying, and in those situations, when you show up in this way and you behave this way, what are the benefits of it? Yeah, and I'm not doing that tactically. I'm not just trying to soften them up for the real stuff. Genuinely interested in how this is served. Because it has served, otherwise it wouldn't have become such a habit. And then there'll come a natural point where we'll say, and what are the costs? And usually they'll know. And if they don't know, well, we can say, well, what do the comments say? Because it's there in the comment.
I love that too, and I'm noticing Bob in the chat mentioned about how being critical is often a way of looking smart, and you just brought that up, Brett, about that someone who's trying to be the smartest person in the room or who believes they're right, you know, will forever believe they're right, and the attempt to change that or to fix that is not the route to go. But this, again, you're talking about that shift into their experience, right? And into giving a concrete example. And so it's not just a theoretical conversation. But I really like that idea of asking for examples and in this particular situation, then what were the benefits and costs? I want to shift a little bit. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, just before you do, I've just noticed my eye's been drawn in the comments to some real gold from Bob and Rachel or Shell. You know, and Bob said, you know, about looking smart and how, yeah, there's an opposite dynamic to the authentic. So learning how to say I don't know is a great practice. And then Rachel has said, yeah, that thing of I'm just saying what's on my mind. And then the idea that there's a way of saying what's on my mind that can be constructive and creative. So I want to flag those and also talk about the timing of them, because they're wonderful experiments to set up. You know, when we're in a coaching space. So what I'm flagging is the importance of timing. I might have some great strategies for them. If I introduce those too early, before there is understanding and recognition, then they might either just argue with me. So, well, I tried that, it doesn't work, because they're so smart. Or they'll agree with me and go out with, you know, the best intention to show the vulnerability of not knowing. But the force of their habit will trump their new intention once they're back in the thick of it. Yeah. And then they failed. So I always say, yeah, one of the first experiments is to be an observer to yourself, to really and come back with an intimate clarity of what this pattern is. Yeah, let's understand it, because that's the foundation for improvement. Then we'll get to what other choices you might make. If I could just give an example. So I had someone who, they had a very strong belief, they said this out loud in the early debriefs: if I don't criticize, that people will never learn. Okay, well, there's a belief, and fair enough. All right, so we talked about the benefits of that. Yeah. And then the invitation was to be an observer to herself in those situations where she felt compelled to criticize so that people would get it. And she came back and said, okay. And she was quite rattled. She said, so this is what I observed. And she didn't observe it in the moment. She observed it at an end of a week review, self-review, which I recommend. So she got to the Friday and she looked back on her week and she recalled a situation where a shoddy piece of work landed on her desk from one of her reports. So she's now reporting to me. She's saying to me what she remembered. The work landed on my desk. I looked at it. I saw it wasn't up to par. I looked at the person and I said, do you know what? I would be embarrassed to show this to anyone. Right? It just boom. She could not say that. It was 3 days later, and to her credit, she did the work of review, reflected on her week, and watched herself do that in review. Then came to her coach and said, what was it like in your body? We did a bit of somatic work. So she's getting to know the cues and clues, the indicators, the heat in her face, the tightness in her chest. She said, it's a kind of simmering rage that I feel. They've done it again, is the self-talk. And then the behavior it propels her into. Now, this is a very unsettling moment of development, but a really important one to hold someone in the discomfort of this and to hold them in it with compassion. Because here's the good news story. A month later, we're doing group coaching. She came back radiant. Because now what's happened is in real time, she saw the pattern. As it happened, she felt the rage. She heard the self-talk in her mind. She felt the compulsion to go and rip them apart. And she didn't. She said, you know what? I just didn't want to. See, so we think often as awareness as a kind of first step to change. Okay, yeah, it is. But awareness is itself transformative. That's the gold. It can itself change everything. And it did in that moment. Now she's in a position to speak to Rachel's fantastic idea about how do you say what's on your mind in a different manner. And I could support her with that. So now she's learning to say to a person, hey, this work isn't where it needs to be. And I'm going to work with you to build that capability so that we can do work we're all proud of. It's going to make a difference for our stakeholders. She got to a point where she could do that in real time in the moment. Now, that's about a 6-month journey. For some people, it takes decades. So let's be humble about, and patient with the work.
Oh, that's a great example. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Brett. So I do want to pivot maybe a little bit and ask one question. Looking at a profile, and I maybe suspect how you both will answer this, but we'll see. Do you ever look for patterns or pairings between dimensions. So if you're thinking, oh, that critical might be one entry point for this leader, but I've got to check. I'm curious about these other two dimensions and how they pair up or how they work together. Do you ever look for patterns like that?
Oh, Sarah, your question has me looking at Jane Smith, the sample.
Okay. Do you want me to bring that up?
Yeah, it's a really curious pattern that potentially is happening. And and whenever I notice something that might be happening, I hold curiosity with it. Oh, thank you.
You bet.
Straight away, look at this triumvirate of self scores in the reactive. Do you mind pushing your cursor there?
Sure.
What
We're
do,
looking. Uh,
um, what do we have? We have high critical self score, high arrogant self score, and next to it, autocratic. Um, so straight away, we're into three bedfellows, if you will, because we know that each dimension has an interface with its neighbor. And then look at the score on personal learner. So personal learner is under the 50th percentile at about the 40th percentile by the looks of it. So straight away in my chest and heart, I'm really curious about what's her worldview here and what's the relationship between those four dimensions.
love that.
Um, thanks, Pete. Yeah, I'm looking at the high scores in caring, connecting, and so just interested in that. It's seen by others. It's recognized in Jane recognizes that. So perhaps that caring, connecting is shining through when people sit down to do a survey about Jane, and maybe that accounts for a slightly lower evaluator score in the critical, sort of offset, counterbalanced by this care. Whereas in Jane's mind, she's recognizing in her inner life that the tug to fault find.
Right. In her inner life.
Yeah.
It's a really cool curiosity there, isn't it?
I'm thinking of that wonderful book, Our Inner Conflicts, by Horney, yeah, Karen Horney, yeah. Played a big part in the development of this instrument. And the inner conflict between pleasing perhaps and critical as well. Maybe the pleasing is managing the critical. So I want to be liked
Yeah.
more than the part of me
Yeah.
that wants to cut everything into ribbons. Um, and work within a conflict is really, really useful to help. Well, I guess it's a Jungian concept, isn't it? That it's not so much about who am I, but how many.
Yeah.
Many different selves. There's a pleasing self and there's a critical self. And one of the great enablers is to create an environment where those different selves can have a voice, and we can just give them a bit of space to tell their story. And then the choice maker, the observer, can just make better choices, having been advised by these different agendas.
That's a really cool connection there. The pleasing, the caring, the parity on those dimensions for self and other. And then look at driven. Driven, there's a meaningful gap. When we say meaningful gap, it's more than 25 percentile points. It's a quite large gap there. There's this driven energy is coming out. And Doug points out, look at the self-score on integrity. Boy, it's such a rich opportunity for Jane to connect her worldviews or those many voices. I think I heard you say, Brett, or how did you say that? Many perspectives for her inner world, and what the evaluators are experiencing in the daytime when we're at the workplace and we're attending to the tasks, Project X, and whatever else Jane's involved with. What are the interactions that are showing up as this inner world expresses itself into that?
Mm.
That can bring a lot of insight, Sarah, as to ask ask Jane to be aware of, well, how are people responding?
Just picking up on the integrity piece, and thanks, Douglas, for that. Reminds me of coming back to the questions related to each dimension.
Yeah.
That as well as being descriptions, they can also be turned into goals. And so if one of the descriptions of integrity is living my values, not just on the good days when it's easy, but on the hard days. So that can be an entry point into, well, what are the values that you hold dear that would also make a difference for the expectations of your role and the value you want to deliver. And which ones do get constrained or diminished by your fear and stress, and which ones do you want to just keep in play and keep in view, and then what would you want to be believing to keep them in view, and what would you want to be doing? So I'm sort of jumping ahead into the coaching space again.
Well, that's perfect, actually, because we should move on so that we have some time to get to questions here at the end. But you've really set up that beautifully, Brett, thinking about coaching and setting goals and sort of doing something concrete for a leader that you're working with. And so if you have a leader who wants to work on critical, maybe as part of their one big goal or just in the bigger scheme of their coaching series with you, what is a good place to start, or where would you maybe help someone? Understanding, of course, that every leader is different and it will depend upon them, but where may be a good place to start helping a leader who wants to work on their critical?
Well, purpose is always a good place to start, and it's something that in the debriefing process, the recommended process, right up front, and even before the first debrief, it's valuable to have conversations about what are we doing this development in service of. So, what is the purpose? What are we seeing on this graph? What in the creative is going to help that purpose, and what in the reactive could get in the road, or what could you draw from in the reactive that might help? But just relax some of the fear and stress and anxiety around it and bring out the gifts. I love what Tom's written in there. There's a lot there. I'll just pick up on one thing about this distinguishing question. Are they critiquing to make things better or just prove things are broken? There's incredible self-awareness that can arrive over time when people can differentiate those drivers, and to do that with compassion. Like, it's a part of us that just wants to be right, and that's okay. That's being human. And there's another part of us that wants to contribute. And if we get to a point where the person can recognize when they're kicking in, wow, well, that's huge.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. I just picked up on something Brett was sharing with that anecdote before, as the way to answer this question, Sarah. So if the participant or the leader has said, if I don't criticize, people will never learn, I'll remember that kernel or that organizing narrative for her. And I'll later ask, hey, I can hear you want people to learn. And that's a way into her own words, and she'll be very keen to warm to that and then organize in a different manner. And obviously the timing of that question's the right important thing. The other thing, because I'm a fan of what Jung would offer as the merit of catharsis, is I ask leaders that score high in critical and arrogant to actually just give me 400 words on a piece of paper about the worst thing that you imagine people could or would say about you. And because the assumption there is that and I've got some healthy criticism and arrogance in me. I learned it a long time ago. It helped me survive an all boys school where criticism was normal. And it was the 80s, so it was a different world. But what I know is when I get activated into critical or arrogant, I'm doing it first so someone doesn't do it to me. So in that way, I like to invite the leader, hey, let's just purge. What is the worst thing people could be saying about you? Let's do 400 words on that. And that's one interesting way to allow the core fear that they're carrying into every organization they work at, just to have them sit with that, with the blank sheet of paper and the bravery of using a pen. And again, timing on that's important. Trust in the relationship's important, etc., etc.
And, I mean, if just to explore what's possible, this is deeper work, and, so just tread with caution. If you feel you have the skills to go into somatic work yourself, and you can do that with a duty of care, and and you invite someone into it and they sign up for it, then to coach someone using processes like what's at risk. Just by the way, we have a masterclass in Asia Pac called Working with the Reactive. And it goes into this, quite a deep process. You can have some pretty extraordinary breakthroughs when people are able to contact the underlying vulnerability that the protecting is trying to save them from having to feel.
Mm.
And taking them through an experience where they can not only feel it, but realize they can be okay with it. And they can look after their vulnerability in another way, other than detaching from the system and throwing hand grenades of criticism from the sidelines. That's an incredibly transformative thing. It is deep work. Some of you out there are perhaps doing it. If you're interested in it, then keep an eye out for the masterclass, because that's one avenue of coaching you can do. If someone's able to just be with their vulnerability and go, wow, you know what, I don't have to be the smartest person in the room. Incredible relief for them, because underneath it all really is a deep longing. I'm dipping into the Enneagram's concepts here. That underneath that prickliness is actually a deep longing for meaningful human connection, that's based on integrity and serenity. But because that serenity and integrity has been breached somewhere along the line in a boys' school or whatever, the conditioning is that I can only get that serenity and integrity by isolation. Now that's a huge understanding to come to. And please never say that to a client in a first debrief. What's going on here is underneath it all is this deep vulnerability. No, it's great for us to understand these things as practitioners, because we can meet people with great regard and compassion. And it is possible over time to help them come to see it and understand it. And it's a journey to go on that is available, it is possible, and it's very exciting work. Just don't rush in. Be mindful of the trap of trying to subjecting your clients to your precious deep work to transform them. Just remember you're the guide on the side, working with them.
The guide on the side. I like that. Peter, I see that you responded to Kelly's question there in the chat, but I did just want to call out that that idea of kind of what's the next step after that 400 words on the worst possible thing someone could be saying about them. Well, that's good. Look, we're coming up on 10 minutes at the top of the hour, so I do want to get to some questions. If you have a burning question that you haven't yet put in the chat or messaged to one of us, that now's the time. But in the meantime, here are a couple of questions that I have for you. One is, what helps you or a leader, or how can you help a leader notice when your feedback crosses from being constructive criticism to being you are being reactive? So what's something that can help a leader kind of recognize that moment?
Sarah, sorry, I just want to connect with the question. Could you say that again? Is it
Sure.
for when I'm being reactive as the coach or as a debrief consultant, or?
Sorry, I was confusing and asking that. So this is asking about how can a leader, how can a leader notice when the feedback they're offering is crossing that line from being constructively critical to being them in their reactive?
Yeah, really cool question, and there's some good insight in the chat about that. And I invite leaders. I've noticed when leaders are being critical, they're usually not looking at the person they're talking to. They're usually in their mind going, for God's sake, you people just stuffed it up again. I've seen a leader do that. So I invite them to rest their eyes on the other and to know that behind the eyes of the other is a whole complex world of passion and authenticity and creativity and intuition and ideation and experience and knowledge and care and love and how are you connecting into leveraging and scaling the effect you're having beyond your own knowledge on what needs to happen for this business to succeed. That's one thing I invite them to do, is to drop their eyes and be conscious of how is it landing, even if people are smiling and nodding, and even if people are silently agreeing with everything, what's actually happening behind their eyeballs.
Oh, that's so good. So good.
That's beautifully put, Pete. Yeah, thank you. Well, I think in concert with that, there's, excuse me, getting to be an observer to their own inner life as well. Like, what are the indicators that I'm in my reactive, that my sharp mind is booting up on fear and stress, and therefore becoming a destructive force, potentially. There are indicators, and if they can get to know them, they can go, oh, hello, there's that simmering rage. Hello, rage. That's a sign that what I'm about to say is probably not going to bring out people's beautiful care and creativity and wisdom. And then so then we've got two worlds, don't we? We've got outward gaze, onto the people around me and how's this landing with them and what's going on in their inner life. And then inward gaze, what am I noticing in myself, and how can I resource myself in my being triggered, and become grounded and then experiment with the experiments that I've set up with my coach, which might be quite practical. I may have even crafted some language, with the help of my coach. And sometimes it can be as simple as when I feel the impulse to set someone straight, I might pause and ask a question instead to help them become more masterful with open questions. Sometimes you can get very simple starting points with people.
Those are great. Those are great. Two excellent practical steps that people can take right now, which I love. Okay, here's another one that is about kind of team dynamics. How does a critical tone, and tone, whether it's spoken or implied, affect a team instead of just one other person? So when you're working with a leader who is maybe a team leader, do you have any different questions or curiosities or experiments that help them work their critical with their team?
Yeah, as I was listening to you, what's come to mind is a CFO I was working with, and he completed his 360s LCP, and then there was 6 direct reports. He scored really high and arrogant. He was famous. Everyone spoke about it. He had an open door policy, and the joke was nobody ever walked through his open door. And I was aware that from the debriefs that the 6 direct reports wanted me to tell the CFO with the open door that there was a $60 million hole in the budget for this $5 billion organization. And it was his fault. It was the CFO's fault. Everybody knew about it. Nobody wanted to tell him about it. They wanted me to tell him about it. So, what's the powerful use of the instrument in this case we aggregated the 6 LCPs for the direct reports and then showed that to this CFO. And what we could see was a response to his high critical We saw very heavy complying and very heavy peer scoring, great criticism against each other as well. So there are two insights. Now, what we did with that was, Brett mentioned guide on the side, is just, I just asked the CFO, hey, with light of this insight, what are the risks of how this team's operating? And I nudged with my question is, I'm curious if there's anything that is unsaid for this team. And that was my way to help him be curious. Rather than me go and say, hey, you got a $60 million hole.
Great maneuvering.
I'll just add fairly just a short high level. How does a team learn? We know that learning correlates very highly to team effectiveness. So if the question is, as a leader, how do I help my team learn? What place does criticism play in that, and how can it be constructive? So these are all open questions to help build a learning strategy, and to engage the team in how do they do feedback with each other, and you can set up some simple principles around that and ways of working, and ideally that's done in a team environment. They can build that little charter together, come to some agreements, and perhaps be supported through team coaching in that.
I love that. I'm sorry we have to cut it off, but we're 2 minutes to the top of the hour, and so I think that's got to be a wrap for us. Gentlemen, this was a really rich conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and for sharing your time. And thank you, everybody who joined us for this really great conversation. We encourage you to join us next month when we explore courageous authenticity with Leadership Circle principal Caro Paez. And in December, when we dive into caring connection, be sure to watch your inbox and Leadership Circle social media for information about future Surfacing Creative Leadership events, resources, conversations, and announcements. And on behalf of Leadership Circle and our featured guests, Brett Wood and Peter Shields, I'm Sarah Stahl saying thank you so much for your time and attention today, and take care. We will see you next month.